Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 163 for the 3rd of Iyar in a leap year. And today we're going to be discussing a really interesting scene in the Bible, a scene which sounds really risque when you hear about it at first glance and might bring up a lot of questions, namely the scene where Yaakov, our forefather Jacob, meets Rachel for the first time. And what does he do? He kisses her and then he begins to cry. And this might sound really strange. It might sound like, first of all, that doesn't sound very modest. It sounds really out of protocol. The first time you meet a woman, before talking to her, before anything, you kiss her. And then secondly, you cry afterwards. So what is that about? And so today we're actually going to be learning that there actually is a deeper meaning, deeper kind of spiritual intent behind all this very interesting story, in the sense that each one of our forefathers and our foremothers, I should mention, so Rachel falls into this category as well, serve as archetypes for different types of attributes. And their souls were very lofty in the sense that they stemmed really from these supernal archetypes, these supernal energies on high that really come ultimately from this highest world of Atzilus, which we've mentioned. So when we look at the story within that context, within the context of these spiritual energies, we actually can understand it in a much, much deeper way. And we can understand that, and speaking of archetypes, what does Yaakov represent and what does Rachel represent? So Yaakov, as we'll learn, represents the attribute of compassion, and Rachel represents the collectivity of the Jewish people, the collective soul of all Jewish people. So as we'll learn today, what was really going on here was actually a very, very deep kind of thing. And it's a big, big, big message for all of us in terms of our service of God. So I think we should get straight into the text to try to see how the Alter Rebbe breaks this down, because I think he does a really good job, if I do say so myself. And I think that he can explain it better than I could. And so just to give a little bit of context before we dive in, is that as many of you know, if you've been following along in the podcast, we've been talking about serving God and how to serve God, and how especially to serve God to the utmost, which the utmost type of service of God is a service of God of where we keep Torah and mitzvahs for their own sake, for no ulterior motive, and how this can manifest in many different ways. This could manifest when we keep Torah and mitzvahs out of fear of God. This could also manifest when we keep Torah and mitzvahs out of love of God. And we talked about the various types of loves of God: innate love that we have to work on, love that's given to us as a gift. You can go back and listen to previous episodes to hear more about those things. And today we're going to bring up a new way of serving God, namely serving God not out of love per se and not out of fear per se, but rather out of compassion. And we'll learn, what do we mean by compassion? What does this look like, and why, and how does this work, and what are we supposed to be compassionate over, and all of that. So let's get into it. So today we're actually going to be learning a full chapter 45 in Likkutei Amarim. So here we go. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says, and here now there is another way, another straight path for a person who to be involved in Torah and mitzvahs for their own sake. And this is through the attribute of Yaakov, our forefather, which is the attribute, as I mentioned in the introduction, of compassion, of rachamim. In order to, what does this mean? This means that a person could arouse within their thoughts, first, a great feeling of compassion before God over the spark of godliness, which vivifies their soul, specifically meaning their godly soul. So we spoke about this previously, that we all have within us a godly soul and an animal soul, and the godly soul of us contains within it a spark of godliness that vivifies it, that gives it life. And this spark of godliness descended from its source in the life of all lives, namely God, the Ein Sof Baruch Hu, the infinite one, blessed be he, who fills all the worlds and surrounds all the worlds, and everything exists as if not in comparison to him. And so this really supreme God, this godliness that's really, really high up there, came down. So imagine this, it came down here into this physical world and vivifies and vests itself in what we call the mashcha de chavaya. That's an Aramaic term that means the serpent's skin. That's the body. So it's like taking this really holy thing, this godliness, spark of godliness, and it's manifest here in this like serpent skin, our physical bodies, which is so far from the light of the face of God with utmost distance. Because, and what do we mean by the fact that it's utmost distance? This is because our world is the utmost place of the klipos, of the coarse klipos. And we spoke about this previously too. What this means, the klipos once again are the husks that conceal godliness from the world, that make us not be able to see godliness as apparent, even though godliness is everywhere. And in our physical world down here, this is the place where the klipos really predominate, where it's really a very opaque state of being. And especially, says the Alter Rebbe, if a person will start to remember all of their deeds and all of their speech and all of their thoughts throughout their entire lives that were not great, that were not so good, and so he will see that this is likened to a king who's captured in trusses, like who's locked up in chains, so to speak. And this is imagery taken from Shir HaShirim, this imagery of the king being locked up in trusses or in chains. And what do we mean by this? That it's locked up? What are the trusses, like the weaves of hair, kind of? This is the weaves of the mind, meaning to say this is like the weaving of our impure thoughts, God forbid, like things that really we get wrapped up in these negative thoughts. And then the Alter Rebbe brings a verse to illustrate this imagery, which comes from Devarim chapter 32 verse 9, which says Yaakov chevel nachalato. So it's likening Yaakov, our forefather, to a rope, to the rope of his inheritance. So now the Alter Rebbe is going to get a little bit more into this analogy, a little bit more this idea of a rope and what this means. And so he says that this is just like somebody who's like pulling on a rope. So it's like, let's say if you were holding onto a rope from a very high tower, or you can maybe picture like Rapunzel with her really long hair. If somebody were to pull at her hair or to pull at the rope that you were holding onto, you would feel it up the top. So this is the whole idea of like, so that every single thing that we do down here, it's like a rope that connects up to heaven. And so when any action that we do here has an effect above. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is actually the secret of the exile of the Shekhinah, of the exile of the divine indwelling. So it's like we're basically bringing this Shekhinah into exile through our negative actions, God forbid. And now the Alter Rebbe brings a couple of citations to elaborate upon this a little bit further, where he says, this one's from Ishayahu chapter 55 verse 7, where it says, Ve'shov el Hashem v'yechamehu, that it says, and let him return to God and have mercy upon him. So meaning to say that the solution for this idea that we're all in exile, the Shekhinah is in exile, is that compassion is the solution to this. And so we need to arouse God's compassion. And what is it that God needs to be compassionate about? About the name of God that is dwelling within us. So, and then again, he brings a verse here, the Alter Rebbe, this is from Vayikra chapter 16, verse 16, which says, that Hashem dwells with us, within them, meaning within us, within their tuma, within their impurity. So God is right here with us in our exile. And so this is something which really should, if we can make God aware of this, we can make him feel compassionate over the exile, over his over his Shekhinah that's dwelling here within us. And this is something that we should feel really compassionate about as well. And so now the Alter Rebbe is going to explain this whole story with Yaakov kissing Rachel and explain it through this lens, which is a really beautiful imagery if you really think about it. So this is, for context, this story and the verse where this is brought up is in Bereshis chapter 29 verse 11, where it says, "V'yishak Yaakov leRachel v'yisa et kolo v'yivek." So a few things happened here. So, and Yaakov kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. So we're going to break down what each one of these things mean. What is Yaakov? What is Rachel? What is this lifting up of his voice? And what is the weeping all about? So the Alter Rebbe explains that, first of all, Rachel. Let's start with Rachel. So Rachel, as is spoken about in numerous places in Jewish literature, is really representative of the Knesset Yisrael, the community of Israel. What is the Knesset Yisrael? This is the source of all Jewish souls. And Yaakov, on the other hand, in his supernal attribute above, is the attribute of rachamim, of compassion, that is found in Atzilus. So Atzilus is the highest of all realms, and this is the source of where Yaakov comes from. This is like the representation of Yaakov above. And so Yaakov is the one that has this ability to be able to arouse mercy for the Knesset Yisrael, for the collectivity of the Jewish people. So this is why they make like a really good pair, because there's Yaakov, which is mercy, and then Rachel, which is the collectivity of the Jewish people. So Yaakov arouses mercy for the Jewish people. Okay, so now that's why we have Yaakov and Rachel. Now, what's this deal with Yaakov raising up his voice? So he raised his voice. It's like this imagery of lifting upwards. So it was like Yaakov was basically going upwards, elevating himself to his source in these higher compassions, like in this level of the supernal compassion, in this level of Atzilus, which is called, what is it there? What is this attribute of mercy called there? It's called Av HaRachamim. This is the father of mercies, and this is the source of all mercy. So it's like really getting to the root source of the mercies. And then what did he do after looking up or rather calling up? Then he cried. V'yivek. So he wept. Why did he cry? What was that about? And so the crying was in order to awaken and in order to draw down from these supernal mercies, from these very, very high up lofty mercies, and to draw it down into all of the souls of the Jewish people, of the collectivity of the souls of Israel, in order to raise them up out of their exile, and in order to unify them with true unity, with real unity with God, in a way of a kiss. So it's like, if you think about again, so now we go back to a kiss. What is a kiss? A kiss is unity. You're uniting mouth to mouth. So this is the idea of a kiss is not only when you kiss is the lips touching, but there's an exchange of breath that happens. So there's a unity of a connecting of spirit to spirit, as it says. And then the Alter Rebbe here brings a verse from Shir HaShirim, which is there's a lot of imagery that's very pertinent to these ideas in Shir HaShirim. This is the verse right at the beginning. This is from chapter 1, verse 2, which says, Yeshkeni v'neshikot pihu. So let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. So there's this imagery involved regarding God that has to do with kissing. So what does this mean? How do we kiss God? When do we kiss God? So this is the idea of whenever we speak, when we talk about halacha, for example, and talk about godly ideas, then this is where we are connecting our speech with God's speech, because God's speech is halacha. So we're connecting our speech to God's speech. So that's a type of kiss, that we're kissing God. And so too, if we connect our thoughts to God's thoughts. So if we think about Torah, the same thing happens. And so too when it comes to action. So again, remember, we have these three garments of the soul. There's thought, speech, and action. So we talked about speech, we talked about thought. Now we're going to talk about action, that when we actually do the mitzvahs, then, and especially the mitzvah of tzedakah and mitzvahs involving loving kindness and giving, these have to do with us being able to connect our action with God's action. Because we know that there's this principle that and this comes from Tikkunei Zohar, where it says that chesed is the right arm. So it's like chesed is connected to the right side, and chesed, when Hashem does chesed to us, this is as if he's actually hugging us. And this is illustrated again in Shir HaShirim in chapter 2, verse 6, where it says, V'imino techakbeni, so that it says that his right arm embraced me, his right arm hugged me. So there's something about that right arm that has to do with hugging. And so when we are involved with learning Torah, so just to recap, this is what the Alter Rebbe is doing now, is when we involve ourselves in Torah, when it comes to our speech or when it comes to our thoughts, when we really meditate and think about God and we really talk about God and Torah and all those things, then this is like we're kissing God, because we're connecting our speech and we're connecting our thoughts with God. And so too, when we involve ourselves with God's mitzvahs, when we actually perform God's mitzvahs in a physical way, this is like God is hugging us, because there's an aspect of chesed to it, especially when we give tzedakah, which is considered like the highest form of a mitzvah, is giving tzedakah, doing good deeds, acts of charity, acts of loving kindness, and through that, and all of that. And now the Alter Rebbe here concludes, and he says that through attaining this aspect of focusing on the rachamim, on compassion, then we can actually come to the level of ava rabba, which is, we talked about, this is the great love. This is the highest form of love that we discussed earlier, and it can become revealed in a person's heart. As is written, Yaakov asher pada et Avraham. So this is a verse from Yeshayahu, chapter 29, verse 22, where it says that Yaakov redeemed Avraham. And so what does this mean, that Yaakov redeemed Avraham? So Avraham is considered the attribute of chesed and of loving kindness and love. And Yaakov, as we've been discussing today, is the attribute of compassion. So even though we've been focusing today about this attribute of compassion as an alternate form of serving God that really has nothing to do with love and fear. So it's not that it actually has nothing to do with it. It actually has a lot to do with love and fear of God. But not only that, it actually can lead to love, because compassion itself can lead to redeeming love. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this is explained elsewhere at length. So that's the end of the section. And so just to recap, so today, the subject of today was really all about compassion, and really all about how compassion can be a really great way to connect to God and to serve God. And this is really illustrated in the story of Yaakov kissing Rachel, because when Yaakov kissed Rachel, this wasn't just like a interesting romantic story that is just like placed in the Bible kind of haphazardly, but there was a lot of spiritual things going on, because Rachel is the Knesset Yisrael, the collectivity of the Jewish souls. Yaakov is the attribute of compassion. And so when he saw her, first of all, he lifted up his voice on high. So he tapped into his source. He tapped into the source of compassion on high. And then he drew down from there through his crying. He drew it down into this world, and then he kissed Rachel to make a real connection, so that this attribute of compassion would now be associated with the Jewish people. And then what does this mean? This sounds really esoteric maybe, and kind of like very abstract, though it is a very beautiful story. What does this mean to us practically is that through arousing this attribute of compassion within ourselves, and we can really think about the fact that it is something to be compassionate about, that our soul, our godly soul, that has that spark of godliness in it, that spark of godliness came down through a really big journey that's like really depressing for it. It's really not meant to be here. This state of exile is not the proper home for our godly souls, for that spark of godliness here. So that's something that we really want to feel compassion over, and we want God to feel compassionate about it. And then in order to connect our compassion with God's compassion, is we do his will, right? And when we do his will, we can do that through using the three different garments of our soul. We can use the garment of thought, speech, and action. So when we connect our thoughts and our speech to God's thoughts and speech, so when we think about Torah, when we speak about Torah, then that actually is like us kissing God, the way that Yaakov kissed Rachel. And when we actually do physical mitzvahs, especially the mitzvahs involving tzedakah and chesed, which are really the ultimate mitzvahs that we want to do, this is like hugging God, and this is like accepting a hug from God, because we know that the attribute of chesed is very much associated with the right side and with hugging. So that is it for today, and we will move on to chapter 46 tomorrow, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.